Eta, hello, the guy. How you, Bongile? How you, Mac?
Jumbo.
Jumbo. How are you, Mike?
I'm all right. I'm technically challenged and I think a bit burnt out. And I'm wondering how I get I've got 3 pictures on about a small section of my screen, and I'm wondering how to get them bigger. There I am. There. Got it. Right. Thank you.
Good. All right.
Well, if you can hear me.
Bongile, your show. Let's start with the check-in.
Okay, guys. Bongile, I'm checking in with. I'm checking in with joy. Joy, and I think a bit of sadness and fear around what does gender-based violence mean? I've just and then what's happening to people in our communities? The meaning thereof. Because I think I had an experience where I had to question that at some point, because I received quite a lot of verbal abuse from a lady, and it was just too much. Swearing at me, and I just felt abused, and I couldn't do anything about it. I just carried that sadness, and I don't know if it was anger, but it was more sadness. So I'm checking in with fear and sadness around that, about how do I deal with it as a man when I get abused like that I'm in.
Mike?
My feeling is joy, and what about the peace? None of the other stuff. All of a sudden, I woke up. Bongile is talking my language, which is domestic violence, which I don't believe is gender-based. Personally, I've been working with it for about the last 6 years, and it's got nothing to do with gender. It works the same way both directions. It's all about control. And it's all about boundaries. So I'm really feeling quite authoritative, actually, at the moment. Otherwise, if we sort of go backpedal 5 minutes ago, I was really feeling pissed off, which is anger, the technically challenged all over the place. And actually, I'm really quite tired. And very indecisive. So I suppose that's got to be fear. There's stuff I need to be doing, which I just don't want to get into. And something I noticed today when somebody nudged me about one of the things I should be getting into, it's like I seem to be very good at responding when other people want things, but when I want things myself, I'm very bad at responding to that. Like going out and enjoying the very beautiful autumn, which we are having at the moment. So I'm in one of these, why do I react in the way I react? What is it that's imbalanced in my life at the present moment? I think that's probably, and I think the answer is self-care. And with that, I'm in. I hope.
Okay, so I'm checking, feeling, how am I feeling? I'm actually feeling pissed off and protected. Somebody said during the week that, what's happening with 1,000 schools, it's going nowhere. Yeah. And there's part of me that kind of got kind of protective about that, and curious about that is how do we support something that's emerging that we make up as we go along. And when it comes to the gender-based violence stuff, I was on a call in December with Mlu, with somebody from Trinidad, a lady from Trinidad who runs the gender-based violence organization. And one of the things she spoke about was not only is gender-based violence about man on woman, but it's also man on man or woman on woman, and that was a shift for me. And my own personal experience is I've been the abuser and the abused in both situations. And then in my third marriage, when I found the violence coming up inside me, that I just walked away. So I recognized it and I walked away, and it's something I struggle with. So there's the physical violence, and then there's the verbal violence. Yeah. And I'm also curious, Bongile, is like how I can support you in your initiative. Yeah. Because I have a habit of getting enthusiastic and saying, yeah, let's go and do things and then take over. So I really want to try and be supportive in the background, but also like to do something. So that's what I'm bringing today.
Yeah, and I think obviously these are difficult conversations. I mean, that's why Thousand Circles is here, because it's when you look at domestic issues, or even if it's not necessarily domestic, because gender-based violence will probably be something that happens in the streets because of verbal abuse. You know, I mean, I agree with Mike. In a home setup, you can call it domestic. If people get what is this verbal abuse that will end up becoming physical abuse, and then it's called it gets given gender-based violence, you know. But also it becomes difficult to abuse or on the backdrop or in the backdrop of women being abused so much in the world, when at the same time I, for instance, as a man, has received it, has been at the receiving end verbally, and how do I deal with it as a man to avoid it being called gender-based? Because if it's verbal and verbal, it's abused. But if it's verbal and physical, it's still abuse. But the physical aspect gives it a different meaning. That is when it's called gender-based, because the physical you can see when someone is abused physically, you know, and often most guys resort to that when they find themselves most men resort to that, and they find themselves in situations where they received a lot of verbal, you know, and yeah, because I think that the idea here is to curb the gender-based violence, but also understand the root cause, you know, which most of the time can start verbal, and also to give guys to provide men with tools and provide even women with tools in this case so that it doesn't happen. It's not an easy conversation because it can almost be seen to be defending. But if you are in the receiving end, how do we equip?
So let me bring something to. Have we lost you, Bongile?
Can't hear Bongile.
Okay. All right, maybe he'll come back. So let me. I mean, while we're waiting for Bongile, maybe you can help me with this one, Mike. But I work in an organization where I'm surrounded by women. Yeah. And what I find is that so I work in the rehab space. I work in the recovery space. I work in. I've caused a whole lot of shit in my life. I got to go to a clinic and sort myself out. And the majority of my staff or my colleagues are women. Yeah. And what I find is that they are so nasty to each other. They really can get really threatened and territorial. And there's Bongile back. You're back,
Yeah.
Bongile.
Yeah, I just got disconnected.
Okay. Sorry about
Yeah.
that. I was just talking about women on women violence, and in my workplace environment where I am, there's a lot of women, and I'm the man, and I'm the leader of the organization, and I find that the women can be really horrible to each other, really nasty and horrible and territorial, and people come to me like, I'm gonna sort this out, I'm gonna sort that, and I just find myself getting kind of split in all directions. And yesterday I got to a point where it was like, fuck it, I can't deal with this. Sort your shit out. And yeah, so I feel really like I don't know what to do with that. I mean, it's a real strange challenge for me.
I think you hit the nail on the head yourself, which is that, and I'm going to be pretty direct about this. You have to sort your shit out first, David. In other words, your emotional or psychic or whatever reaction to the way they behave has to be handled before you can start asking them questions. In other words, you're looking at what that you're. If you put yourself as in the role of an anthropologist going to visit an extremely isolated tribe that nobody understands anything about, you actually got to be able to stand there and say, "Look, you're doing this. Can you explain to me why?" But I experience at the present moment, and I'm guessing, and this is my projection or whatever, is that the way they relate to one another is pressing some button in you, which means, I don't want to have anything to do with this. This is not my job. Well, it is your job. You're running the organization.
Okay, so I've been misunderstood there. What I find is that if I need to do any more kind of personal work around this, I mean, we have a job to get done. And the more I mean, like for us, the kind of the world is on fire and we have to go out and do things. But if there's all this infighting and people are not able to fulfill their roles and function in a way that's supportive of each other.
So could it sound as simple as this? Like David stand there and says, "Listen, ladies, I'm the only bloke working in this particular organization. What I observe, or my interpreter, when it's going to sound like Rosenberg. When I see you doing this, that, and the other, I interpret it as being rather conflictual, and my judgment is that it's not helping us getting the job done. Now, am I? Do you understand what I mean? Using non-violent communication sort of technique.
Yeah, I get all that. I'm just like, pass the fucking theory on all of this shit. It's
What
like,
you're past, I know you're past the theory, but I'm actually bringing you back to the theory because I'm saying, would that work as a way of handling it and basically treating them, saying, treating them as if they are adults? Your judgment is they're not behaving like adults. Your judgment is they're behaving in a manner which is unlikely to help performance in the organization. But that's your judgment. They maybe think it's the right way of doing it. And until we turn a mirror on them, okay, that's another idea. Borrow from Swedish day homes, okay? They set up a bunch of CCTV cameras and left them running for a week, and then they cut all the footage together to show the people who were looking after the kids how unbelievably differently they reacted to boys as against girls. So set up some CCTV cameras, pick out all the best juicy dramatic. Serious. I'm really serious.
Yeah, I get that. But I mean, we need to put food on the table before we can start having the luxury of CC cameras everywhere.
Maybe you're not examining the conflict in the organization is definitely impeding the ability to put the food on the table. At least that's what I hear your judgment is.
Bongile, back to you, mate.
Okay, I think for me, it's I hear his point. Look, he's got a valid point. In a perfect environment where we have abundance of resources, or businesses are doing well, I'm sure it wouldn't be difficult for you to put that investment down to curb that conflict situation there. But I think on a female male situation, I mean, most we were all raised by women, and most guys are raised by women. Let me not generalize like that. Most men were raised by women, and the women were also raised by women. And having been mentored by women, it means women can easily go into they become very good speaking their emotions, and to a great extent, I don't know where does the abuse come from, but with most guys don't know how to verbalize their emotions, and we've also been mentored by feminine energy. We get married to feminine energy, so you're already starting on the back foot. And what I realized to be a problem is that because we don't know how to express ourselves well, or I don't know how to express, I didn't know how to express myself well. I'll keep quiet and get verbally abused for a long time. Keep taking it and taking it and taking it and taking it until one day I burst, right? Woman to woman, it becomes an explosive, a verbally abusive environment, because they both are good at going at each other verbally. If it were guys, most guys will go physical on each other, and which is where I think you find yourself in a situation where it's a verbal crossfire. People just talking. But I'm more interested in how do we counter that verbal explosion as men to avoid gender-based violence. I don't know if I make sense.
I'd really like to know how would you define gender-based violence, because as far as I'm concerned, violence is violence. It doesn't matter if it's amongst lesbians, if it's amongst male homosexuals, if it's a man being violent to a woman or a woman being violent to a man. It's all just violence. It's all control stuff. I'm forcing you, either by hitting you or by threatening you economically or emotionally or sexually,
I'm making you do something which suits me, or I'm making you stop doing something which doesn't suit me. It's all very simple. The reason that it gets more problematic in the domestic field is because in the domestic field, and I'm talking now from the Nordic point of view, okay? The reason it gets more problematic in the domestic field is that very many people, the domestic field is the domestic area, this little insular, what is it called? Little family unit, as in 2 adults plus 1 or 2 kids. This is the only place where you really relax and allow to feed yourself, and therefore you get a whole lot of junk coming up when in this very really trusting environment, which you don't see in the workplace. Most of the guys and most of the women I'm working with who are violent towards their partners, in their workplace, they're very often regarded as extremely good employees and highly competent individuals. And I had one very interesting case of a guy who was very violent in his home towards his wife and his daughter, but at his workplace, he was known as a person who had a very strong, he had a very strong threshold of chaos. He could handle an awful lot of chaos and an awful lot of confusion in his work situation. In his home situation, totally different. As far as I'm concerned, this is not gender based. This is people trying to control other people.
But I wanted to say something very interesting.
There's a whole book of it written by a Norwegian guy who I give a lot of time to, which is called the English translation would be the intention, or the idea behind violence, or the intention behind violence. What is the violence about? Well, the violence is about getting you to stop saying something which is pissing me off, and it's pissing me off because it's pressing my buttons, and I have absolutely no control over my buttons. We run through a very simple process with the mostly guys who come to us, and it's basically say, okay, tell us the story, and then we say, well, here's the model. Does it work for you? And the guys who are coming voluntarily, and quite often have quite a reasonable level of self-understanding, that would say that they're under 35. They've been brought up in an environment where you can talk about projections, and most people know what you're talking about. They will basically say, yes, shit, what she's doing is pressing a button about my being reliable. And since I'm dependent on her for emotional support, I don't get it anywhere else, then I will do anything to stop her thinking that I'm unreliable. That was a very, very short version of what's happening. But basically, it comes back to initiation process. A guy who's had his umbilical cut by other men, and who's got a good supportive group of blokes around him. If his lady presses a button, he can say, I'm getting a button pressed. If his lady has a problem, he can stand there and say, I'm not going to take any more of this behavior. You seem to have a problem about this. You need to get professional help with it. I am not your therapist. And if this doesn't get better, I'm going away. A woman said to me many, many years ago, but I still remember it, it's like, we've been in a relationship for about 6 months, and she said, I love you dearly, but I'm not prepared to put up with this behavior. This is the end of the relationship. Boom. So it's all about setting boundaries. But if I am a frightened male who is dependent on a replacement mother for my emotional support, then there is no way I can set boundaries about her abusive behavior.
Hey, Bongile, this shit's going deep, bro.
What?
Yeah, look, I think for me, it's like this, Mike. I think I want us to have these conversations, because the fear of not having these kind of conversations result in more gender-based, as I say, gender. But I hear you. In South African context, Mike, there's a lot of infights between the genders, the females and the males, which results in death and other bad things that are happening to women in South Africa. And because of that, as a South African male, it was difficult for me to have this conversation because I can almost be seen to be defending or justifying the act of males. But I'm talking about it from my perspective. And listening to you speak, it just brought a discussion that I was having in another circle of men's initiation circle about if I grew up in a household where I've never seen my parents argue and end up agreeing about issues, that every time my dad was in a conflict or a conflict discussion or disagreement with my mother, he decided to leave the house and not deal with the issue. That's probably how he's modeling that for me. So it takes away from me learning how to deal with verbal abuse when I experience it in my own life from the feminine energy, and that ability to know how to deal with such encounters, it limits or it stops gender-based violence. And one other thing that I wanted to add was a situation where the inverse situation is also possible, where you get a guy that is verbally abusive, but is also physically strong, but is abusive to a woman. He's verbally abusive and physically strong. So there's no way that this woman will survive in that situation, because this guy can be verbally abusive and is also abusive physically. You know, then it goes back to tools, to equipping people with tools of how to deal with situations like that. There's obviously a shadow work that people have to do in order for them to deal with that kind of abuse, where your warrior energy, your king, and everything, and all your shadow work, all your dark archetypes need to be dealt with. To know that in a situation like this, I need to stand up for myself. But by just speaking about shadow and not giving it meat about the actual situations, then we're unable to equip men and women in some cases about gender, verbal abuse that in some cases leads to physical. Yes.
Okay, so I personally do not. If the guy rings and says, "Look, I'm having problems in my marriage. Can I come and talk about it?" Then we can talk about it on the phone, or usually we sit down face to face. I never start talking theory. If the guy is motivated and he wants to turn up and do something about a situation he's unhappy about, or he's got a woman pointing a gun at his head saying, "If you don't do something about this, I'm going to report you to the police," which is the situation we have here. There's got to be some motivation. I never start throwing words like, gender-based violence or shadow or king, warrior, magician, lover. It's just totally meaningless, in my opinion. I ask him, what's the situation and what do you want? And then I run up. Then I say, look, we've got a model for this. I don't know if it's going to work for you. Can we try you putting this into your model? And then we run through this business about you're trying to regain control because you're frightened of experiencing something. Now, if you can handle the fear, which you have, of experiencing fear or desertion or whatever, then if you can recognize which button is being pressed, then we can work out a strategy to avoid doing it. But I never, at this point, I'm going into some sort of weird, very difficult to understand form of terminology. I mean, how many of the average population know what shadow is, or what king, warrior, magician, lover is, or what an initiation process? They don't. It's not the time. If the guy, after he's sorted himself out and got his relationship back on an even keel, comes along and says some of the stuff we were talking about is interesting, then I might say, okay, we'll go on to the men's on Thursday evenings, and you might be able to work better insight. But it's it's no point in saying, okay, man, you've got a gender violence problem, because it's personal, and the motivation to change is personal. So for me, it's about, what's happening, what do you want, and having to deal with my buttons being pressed, because they will be.
And I think for me, Mike, when you're referring to your buttons, sorry, just to interject there.
Sure.
The buttons are speaking to that part of us we hide, or we suppress, and we deny. And obviously,
Sure, but that's not the first conversation. That's my explanatory knowledge up here. That's the theory that I'm using. But trying to talk to somebody and say you're hiding, repressing, and denying, or it's in the shadow, for me at least, I would be putting between him and me a layer of not misunderstanding, a layer of confusion. I'd be introducing a new concept that he doesn't need. At the present moment, he knows that he's really ashamed of himself because something happened yesterday evening or a week ago that he really doesn't like, or it's been going on for a month and he's really unhappy with it, or his wife saying, hey, you need to talk to the guys at the shelter. They can probably help you with this. I've heard they're good. He doesn't need a whole load of theory. If I'm going to teach somebody to drive a bus quite quickly, I'm not going to go into the mechanics of how petrol explodes and produces a movement up and down of a cylinder. I'm going to say, here's the brake, here's the accelerator, here's the clutch, and here's the steering wheel.
Mike, just move your mic.
When you speak, put your mic up here. Yeah.
Sorry. So it's like when the guy turns up, he is looking for a solution. I don't want him. I want to help him to find his solution.
Yeah.
Which means understanding about himself. It's not a good time to give him a basic introduction to Iron John, Gillett and Moore, or anyone other of the gurus. It's basically saying, okay, so what's happening? I've got some lovely exercises here, which I'm happy to share with you because I've already translated them to English for the Mexicans because they're also dealing with this. And I really do think it's got to be taken out of the gender violence area and say, and more into, hello, mate, tell me your story. I do understand. I know how it feels to want to kill my wife. And let's see what we can do about it. But it's definitely not, it's not a time for theory. It's because somebody could get killed. The woman, and as far as I'm concerned, if the guy's getting beaten up, then it's the same story that we tell him that we tell the ladies who say we're being beaten up, and it's like, leave the house.
Okay, David, what do you think?
What do I think?
Yes,
yeah. No, I always take it back to my own perspective. Yeah. And I always think everything about me. So I grew up in a violent alcoholic home where I would see my mum being abused, and I would see my mum stay in the marriage. Yep. And when I remember one time when she had a black eye, and a friend of hers said, oh, what happened to you? And she said, oh, I got hit with a tennis ball. And then I remember being a little boy looking up at her and going, don't lie, Dad hit you. Yeah, I didn't say it out loud, but there was there was like a message going on there. Yeah. And at that time, I made a choice not to inflict violence. Like when I grow up, I'm not going to do that. Yeah. My first marriage, my wife was incredibly abusive and violent. Yeah. There were times when I'd been hit with a hockey stick or a frying pan, a pot. Like it was real fucking violence. And there was that part in
physical violence.
Physical. She'd attack me.
Was there an emotional violence also? Did you ever feel emotionally violated Yes.
Oh, you think so? Absolutely. And I felt very confused about it. And then I thought, well, what do I do? Who do I talk to about this? It's like, who am I getting beaten up by? This woman's beating me up,
But do you think there are platforms where males can actually verbalize and talk about their
well, I'm
kind of
talking about it now, Bongile.
aware messages? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm sharing my experience. My second marriage, yeah, I became the violent one. Yeah. And I got to a point where I got to a place of shame where I realized, oh my God, I've turned out to be not only be my father, but actually to be worse than him. And then I got the shame in there, made me kind of wake up and say, I got to sort my shit out. Yeah. Then in my third marriage, yeah, so there's a bit of a pattern here. When it got to that kind of conflict, there was a point where I realized, I just felt that thing come up, and I turned around and I walked away, and I thought, I can't handle this anymore. You need to go and get help. And at that time, my wife at the time was cutting herself, locking herself in the bathroom, running down the street in the middle of the night, accusing me of all sorts of stuff. There was really stuff there that I was ill-equipped to kind of handle. Yeah. And I needed to sit down and try and work out how I personally was being impacted. Yeah. And then that marriage ended. So I mean, I'm clearly the last person to talk to about how to have a successful relationship. Yeah, but
I don't agree with you. I think you've got three strategies there with varying degrees of success. I'm going back to Bongile's first question. It's definitely not ignoring you, David. David's doing exactly the answer to your question, and I am prepared to do as well. I can talk about my plan. You actually need to get the guys in. You said, are there platforms where men can talk about this stuff? And the answer is yes. And your experience, well, you can create one. All you have, I mean, my attitude and the attitude of my local organization is that the biggest problem related to what we call domestic violence, you call it gender violence, whatever, is that nobody's talking about it. So basically, the answer is talk about it openly, write letters to the newspaper, tell them you're a violent person, tell them there's somewhere they can talk about violence. We welcome violent men. We want to help you use that energy in another way.
You're right.
Because you then break the taboo, which is the problem. Domestic violence is not the problem. The problem is that nobody wants to admit they've been doing it because it's been put into the shadow, you could say. And the reason it's been put into the shadow because the problem is enormous. There's a reliable bit of research which was done in Stockholm in 2013, Stockholm, Sweden, which said basically all they did was to ask a broad range of the population, both men and women, have you been subjected to, and then the definition of violence. In other words, both physical, emotional, sexual, economic, and latent. And if I remember the results, I'm not sure I got it exactly right, but the 42% of the women said yes, and 28% of the men said yes. But my opinion is that most people don't want to know that the problem is this big, because it's one of these, it's like it's no, it can't be happening in my village. It's got to be happening somewhere else. Or it's like, I don't want to admit that failure in my relationship or in me. When you approach guys and say, look, it's perfectly okay. I know how it feels to want to beat your wife to death. There can be really challenging situations in any close relationship. Let's talk about it. Then you're getting somewhere. So you're like, the answer is two or three people in a leadership have to put themselves into a leadership situation and decide to start talking about it. And I've been in Sweden for 50 years now, and when I came to this country in 1970, not only were nobody was talking about domestic violence, in fact it was denied, they were also denying homelessness, they were denying alcohol, and they were denying suicide. Now,
they were in denial.
What?
They were in denial.
They were in total denial. But the interesting thing is that over those 50 years, I've seen 3 of those 4 actually move into mainstream. Now there are active processes to get homeless people into shelters. There are active processes to get alcoholics into rehabilitation. You work in one, David. At least I don't know what sort of rehabilitation. Anyway, there are active processes to inform. The last one that's come online now in the last 5 or 6 years is active work to hinder suicide, making more people, or basically you're teaching more of the population to be able to say to their friends, "Have you thought about killing yourself?" rather than being embarrassed by it. And all the analysis that I've seen about why we're not saying that is exactly the same as the reason we're not talking about violence, because we know we have it in us and we're shit scared of it because it's been turned into a taboo. Now, at least in Sweden, we've made beating women something you can talk about. Beating men and being a man who beats is still not something which you can't talk about. It's still in the denial process, but we're moving. And as far as I'm concerned, it's all about talking about it. It's just about talking about it. It's a bit like, if you any conflict situation, the best way of creating a conflict is to brush it under the carpet. And I will now rest my peace, Your Honor. Yes.
I think for me, there's it's like this whole beating. You see, for me to have this discussion today, it was difficult. The whole thing of beating each other and male beating women, it goes into shadow. I like the fact that you said.
Well, that's your problem.
In that shadow, the feeling is shame. It's shame.
That's your problem. When you dealt with that and deal with it pretty quickly because you're passionate about working about this, then you can go out and say, I used to have a problem with this. I've dealt with it to other men and help them. I mean, I don't regard somebody. I mean, this is going to be personal now. It's like you have a problem with shame. When you've dealt with your problem of shame in relation to violence, then it will not be a problem for you to talk with other people about it and open that platform that you're talking about. So at the present moment, there are plenty of platforms. The barrier to the one you're talking about seems to be Bongile and his relationship to his own violence. I think violence is perfectly normal. Violence is perfectly normal. Animals do it quite a lot. In society, we put a taboo on it, and most of the time we control it quite well. But if you don't carry on looking after it carefully, and particularly if you deny it, it will start coming up out of the shadow and biting you in the arse. And that is what is happening now in this very tense situation for most people, which is called COVID.
Bongile, is this helpful for you?
I don't care. I just want to beat him up.
What an asking him up.
Yeah. So I think, Dave, do you want to say something there, Dave?
Yeah, no, I want to know if this is helpful for you. I mean, this is your mission. This is your idea. This is, you want to create 1,000 Circle. This is your topic.
Yeah, for me, it's like what we'll do, like every weekly, and it's definitely working, David. I want to invite even other men that are maybe out there that are experiencing any kind of violence, even women, in this discussion. I think maybe have other discussions where women can also participate and have like a fruitful and nation building conversation where it is not just one way, because I feel like the way that this gender-based violence, domestic violence, as Mike is saying, issue is been discussed one-dimensional, you know, and people are. I mean, I as a South African, I know maybe for Mike it sounds like it's easy for you to just go talk freely about it. Me as a South African, it's very easy for me to be received as trying to defend the act of violence, you know, towards women specifically. I am not in defense of that. I want it to stop, but I also want to deal with the root cause. I want us to discuss in this circle ways and coming up with solutions around that when we are equipping people with tools of how to counter violence is when it's about to come. So what we'll do then, I think, we'll have a structured program every weekly, as we are doing and discussing various issues. But I think this one is very sensitive and it's very important, and maybe also it will also speak to other activities or other things that people do in order to cope. Like, for instance, some people become alcoholic, others become addicted to drugs, you know, others do other things, you know, trying to run away from dealing with this issue. Because you can imagine if someone like me from my past was, I learned from my father that you can just leave the house. I will leave the house. What happens when I'm outside of the house? I find friends where I'm going to be drinking with, getting involved in other things, and the situation becomes bigger. For if I'd had tools, I would have been able to deal with the problem that I'm having in house. So, yeah. Okay, Mike.
All right, guys, I gotta go.
Okay, I'll carry
Okay.
on. You want to check out, Dave?
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks, guys. Carry on. I hope this carries on without me.
It will do.
Yes, no, it will. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, Mike.
I was thinking, it's like, so you learn. What you're saying is that you learn from your father.
Please speak to your mic. Speak
Sorry.
to your mic. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
You learn from what your father did was to leave the house.
And most males that I know, you know,
Yeah, okay.
when they were in it, yeah.
So what I'm wondering is, and most men do this, and this maybe I don't know, but actually leaving the house is quite good.
But how long are you going to leave it if you're not dealing with a problem? Because within no time it becomes.
Okay. Leaving the house is quite good, because it means that you don't yourself you go into passive violence. Actually, you don't, because I mean, actually leaving the house is a violent behavior. I can interpret leaving the house as a violence behavior. It is likely to make the person who is left less likely to be violent next time. So you've got two things there. It's like, why am I leaving the house? Well, you say because that's what my dad did, and I'm saying, well, why did your dad do it, and what is the effect? Then you're also saying, but I don't have the tools to do anything with it, to do anything after that. And I'm saying, well, you know, if you can teach 5 or 6 guys a tool to deal with it, and they can do the preparatory work to talking with their partner in a safe space where there are 5 or 6 other men who are talking about how they do violence, or how they are subjected to violence. I think it's very, very, very important here not to get the men, or not to allow the men actually to go into their victim roles. Violence is something that you and I and anybody who's doing it has to be personally responsible for. I can't turn around and say, my partner is such an irritating fucking German bitch with no sense of fucking humor whatsoever, and she doesn't understand me, and that's why I yell at her. That is not a justification.
Yeah.
I have to, it's like, so she is a fucking irritating German bitch with no sense of humor, and she presses my buttons, but that does not give me the right to beat her up in one way or another.
Exactly. But now,
the women who've been meaningful in my
what happens
life,
is that.
Yeah. Go on. What happens is what?
What happens there is that people need to be given tools, right, to avoid violence. I mean, for me, I avoided. I mean, when I was insulted and all that, this past weekend, I decided, you know what, I'm not gonna do anything. And you see, when someone will provoke you to a point that they want you to do that. I mean, I was provoked with that, and I decided to know what, to stay away from that. But my question was, as I left, or as I decided to excuse myself from the situation, I carried a lot of sadness and fear of what if I had also retaliated, verbally or otherwise, you know? And there's a part of me that felt like I felt defeated, because also the legal system in South Africa, when such a thing happens and a woman will go, I mean, a man finds himself, a woman goes there and they say the guy was doing this to me, you immediately you go to you get persecuted, you know. Yeah, I felt weak after that incident. I felt defeated. I must be honest with you. And with all the tools that I have, I managed to put a shield, you know, on whatever that was said, and left the situation. But it's because I have done the work. What about the guy that didn't do the work?
I have a question. The line is not brilliant, but I want to check whether or not I'm misunderstanding you. But it sounded like the underlying problem is you're not wanting to feel weak.
The underlying problem was,
hang on. I don't want you to analyze that. Have I understand you right or wrong?
I think part of it is right. Yeah.
So can we just stay there? Now, what you're talking about is a situation where you, in your childhood, experienced being weak. You couldn't control the situation. You developed a strategy for managing that situation, and you've taken that strategy which you created for managing your situation from your childhood into your adult life. Now, what I very often end up talking with the guys that I'm dealing with is, but you're no longer weak. But when the button gets pressed, you feel the experience of weakness and the complete lack of control which that weakness when you were 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years old brought with it. You don't have to feel powerless again. It's okay to feel weak, but the problem with weak is that it's no problem feeling, for me, it's not a problem feeling weak. I mean, it's like, I've got these machines in front of me, they're fucking up. It's like, what do? Am I terrified of the feeling behind weakness, which is lack of control?
or I'm going to sit here and say, okay, so when I finish this call with Pongile and David, then I need to ring Stian because he's much better at this stuff than I am. Or do I just start chucking things around the room? You understand me? Behind the weakness, there is a fear of powerlessness, which is not quite the same thing. The weakness in a 4 or 5 or 6, 7-year-old was like totally destabilizing. And my experience is that most of the guys that I've worked with, they will do anything to avoid having this very destabilizing sense of powerlessness re-stimulated. So now I'm using quite complex words, but you understand them, I think. And most of the guys, if they're turning up voluntarily and saying, I want to do something about this, it's not a big problem for them to connect with what they're frightened of, and also connect to the idea of like, okay, so I learned to do that when I was 5, but now I'm 35 and I'm running a company, or I've got a good job, or, you know, I've got a stable adult life in most areas. But just in this situation with partners, then my button gets pressed. I can handle the board, I can handle my junior managers, and I'm known as a very diplomatic person, but just together with my partner, my button gets pressed and I go completely out of the board. Is this making sense to you?
Yeah, I think for me, yeah, I managed to control that, but there was a part of me that felt I don't know why I felt shame, you know, being insulted like that. Huh?
Shame is something you are taught to feel.
Indeed. Look, I obviously I can go into that and I can see it, but obviously there's a general shadow that we are speaking to for most men, you know. Then I felt.
I'm sorry, I'm getting tired of MKP's insistence on putting big labels on things. No, I really am. Because I mean, think after you found this rather superficial label to be helpful to understand yourself, it then starts becoming a problem.
Exactly. Funny enough, right? Mike, I was having this discussion with who was having this discussion with?
Right. So
Mike,
Pongile, you're going to have to go back. The sound broke down. The last thing I heard you say was, I was having this discussion with. And that's what I last heard. Okay.
Yeah, I had this discussion with someone about the language usage in MKP, or this intellectual talk, or the figurative or metaphoric talk that makes it difficult for people to understand simple concepts.
Yep.
And yeah, I find myself just using the same word, you know, and yeah, and it takes away from people learning how to reason things well, because it's like they are hidden in complex language, you know. Anyway, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah,
MKP is a hierarchical, exclusive, or has a history of being a hierarchical, exclusive organization.
Yes.
It is rapidly changing.
Yeah.
But it still has an awful lot of baggage related to being a hierarchical, exclusive organization. And one of the things is a lot of mumbo jumbo stuff, you know, called like, you know, Shadow and King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. And I personally, not just theoretically, but practically, I am committed to keeping the mumbo jumbo out of it. Together with another Swedish guy, we have created and we have run a leadership training for men who want to run men's groups.
but we do not talk about shadow. We do not start by talking about shadow. We do not, you know, we don't call it king, warrior, magician, lover. We say, you know, there is a decisive part of you, there's a creative part of you, there's a supportive part of you, and there is an active part of you. So, you know, we're really trying to divest this from the mumbo jumbo and bring it back to the individual.
Yeah, because I think for me,
I love my shadow. My shadow is my greatest asset. It has kept the food on the table for my kids, and it's paid for my rent.
and also, in fact, I was talking to some guy about translation of the material of the material that we use. You know that because it doesn't make sense to an ordinary black person that speaks vernacular when we talk about shadow.
It doesn't make sense to an ordinary British guy working in a car mechanic. It doesn't make sense to ordinary people.
Yeah, it's like using I remember when I did science, I had to learn a science table. I had to learn what are these things called before I can learn. You know, they're in groups. I feel like it's also made to be something like that when it can be simplified. But hey, so it's been beautiful, you know, just having this discussion. But I guess, yeah, we'll continue and see how, yes, we can transform people and simplify the material to really help men to learn and people to learn. Because I used to get stuck in the linguistic mumbo jumbo, you know, of shadow, of archetype, you know, all that. And whereas it's very simple, you know, because it was made to be too academic
Yep.
for an ordinary people to understand. When the work is really about people, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I have a couple of comments to this. Like, you know, one of the guys I'm working with locally, he has done an MWTA, but he's decided he's never going to go near MKP again. He also done an IGFT. He's a great counselor. He's a great I group leader. He is a car mechanic. And what he, you know, the thing that he brings me back to all the time is like, how can I make this stuff relevant for the guys in my workshop?
Uh-huh.
And the other thing is that, you know, that as I said, MKP, you know, the only hierarchy that MKP has is the international leader body. You know, it's like, you know, you get gold stars for being able to run an NWTA. And then you get, you know, it's like it's an unbelievably narrow path. And as far as I'm concerned, it's got nothing to do with me whatsoever. Running an NWTA is not the pinnacle of human achievement. It's one way which works for some people to get to personal understanding. And I think that, you know, what you're working with and what I'm working with is basic human behavior. And I mean, it's like, as I said, the Norwegian guy I've been writing about, he's been doing this stuff for 30 years. Okay, it's Norway, and the Norwegian mentality is not the same thing as the South African mentality. Blah 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 blah. But it's not. It's still quite a lot of it's relevant. I mean, and this guy is very pragmatic. There's a lovely exercise which he uses, which is basically the first one he uses with anybody coming into the room, and this is, you can do this in groups as well. And he basically says to the guys, "Okay,
your mic."
Yeah. So he basically says to the guys, "I want us to be able to have a common language." And obviously, you know, you're here because you've exerted some sort of violence on your partner, and it could have been physical or it could have been emotional. I don't give a shit. It's like, okay, so there's a point when you're actually making somebody else hurt.
Yes.
Right. And that's what do you call that? And Mike says, well, I say I'm really fucking angry, so I hurt the bitch. And the next step is like, okay, so that's number 6 on a scale from 1 to 6. And what we're going to do now is to work backwards from 6. So what are you doing before you actually hurt her? And it could be, well, I'm probably speaking louder.
Mm.
Okay, so what do you do before you're speaking louder? Well, actually, I go silent. I stop communicating before I start shouting. Okay, so now we're on to number 6, 5. We're now on number 4. So what do you do before you get? What do you experience yourself in your body before you get quiet? Well, often I'm feeling confused. And and then down at number 1, it might be I'm drumming my fingers on my table. And what you teach the guy, and this is, I'm not going to say this is going to work in 100% of cases, but it works in an awful lot of cases. What you basically do is say, okay, so when you recognize you're doing number 1 or doing number 2, that's the time to do something else. Go out, take the dog for a walk, cut the lawn, anything physical, because all this stuff, this irritation, is happening in your mind. So I'm talking about really pragmatic, hands-on stuff. That's what you can do to stop the guy getting into a worse situation. In Sweden, they get locked up, because the women have an extremely good support system. There are women's shelters all over the country. If a woman rings up a women's shelter and says, this man's beating me, then the women's shelter will say, fine, good, we will give you a new home, we'll lift you out of there, and we'll make sure that he ends up in prison. And it works very well. So the guys are under quite a lot of threat in this country. And so they're quite motivated to change their behavior. But as I said, it has to start with basic, how do we stop you from making this worse, and doing that before we get into psychological mumbo jumbo, which I don't think you need. But developing an understanding of why they're doing what they're doing doesn't mean that they have to have done an NWTA. It's much simpler than that. Again,
Yeah, I know.
The start point is that the guy is motivated to change his behavior, and that's either because he really does love the girl and he doesn't know what the fuck happened. A lot of the guys turn up with us and say, I don't know what flew into me. And
Yeah,
it's because,
and I think, Mike,
yep,
I think it becomes difficult to. Obviously, you're talking to. It goes back to what they call a shadow, But how do we simplify it in our language so that people can understand this time? Yes.
Well, if somebody comes along to me and says something like, I don't know what flew into me, or it's like, I don't do that normally, then basically I don't go and talk about shadow. I'm saying it's this, because I think shadow is a quite complex concept.
Yeah.
And I will tend to go into, look, we all react in different ways in different times of different situation. You talk to your boss in one way, you talk to your mum in another way, you talk to one of your customers in a third way, you talk to your 5-year-old daughter in a fourth way. So this is just an extension of this. You don't know what got into you, because it doesn't happen very often, but we can look at what got into you. So basically what I've done is to introduce the concept of sub-personalities. In other words, we have different parts of ourselves which are relating to different parts of the outside world, which is actually quite close to King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, in my opinion, is too limiting and too academic. There's another structure called sub-personalities, which turns up in psychology. Anyway, as a anyway, it turns up in a lot of therapies. And so you bring in these concepts in a very easy to understand form.
I think a guy's name is Francois that I was talking to him about this, to say, I do training for small businesses,
Yep.
And sometimes we're doing training or lecturing small businesses on topics that are seen to be too complex, or are prescribed in a very complex manner. And I have to simplify it to a point where this person that is running a talk show or an informal salon somewhere needs to understand.
Yep.
That I feel like, as I was having this discussion with him, our material needs to be simplified to
Yep.
that core, you know, so that because now I'm dealing with people from grassroots here. I'm not dealing with an academic person or anyone.
I'm not dealing with academics most of my time. I'm not dealing with MKP men most of the time. I'm dealing with ordinary men with a
Yes,
wide,
that's what I'm talking about.
and I can't go into psychological theory. It's just not meaningful.
It's
But
not.
this is basic pedagogics. Before I got into the men business and this stuff, I was into sort of teaching and lecturing, and there's a bit of knowledge from that which is reasonable, which is like, if you're going to teach a group of people, you've got to find a common ground. You've got to give them, that you've got to find a place, or you've got to give them a place, or give them some knowledge which they all has a sort of a root from which to grow.
Mhm.
And too much theory is, it's fine for theoreticians, but it's not always very good for the people on the street. I mean,
It's not.
So I was thinking of COVID. I mean, it's like there's absolutely no point in giving the vast majority of the population theoretic knowledge about what a virus is and how it spreads. It's
Just hold on a
totally,
second. Just hold on a second.
You need to
Give me a
know
second.
how to stay safe and not get infected.
Yeah, just give me a sec. Just hold on a sec. Yeah, sorry about that, Mike. My internet was just going down.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's cool, Mike. I think I'm very happy that we have this discussion, and yeah, I think I'm going to have a structured program that will deal with different topics every week, and then I will give you a list of all the different topics. I already spoke to some of my friends that are also in business, that are entrepreneurs, whom will have discussions, about their businesses. I mean, in one of the circles, I have COVID circles, I have entrepreneurship circles, I have business circles, I've got student circles. So, but all the communication will happen in the 1,000 circle space. But I see about in men's work, we can talk about issues that are related to men. But I will give you a schedule of the different days when we're going to be talking about different things. Yes. But I'm grateful. Yeah.
But don't get too hung up in MKP stuff.
No, yes, yes.
Because it was like, so I mean, the only reason I'm working with MKP was because back in 2011, my local men's group, which was running a hotline, decided that we needed tools to help men to understand themselves, so they didn't need to ring a hotline. And I had this vague memory that I'd done a training back in '97 with some guys who seemed to know what they're doing with men, and that was MKP. So I found my way back, and basically, so it's like, fine, good. MKP's got some tools to solve some pragmatic problems that we have here in Sweden. And ever since then, we've just been, we're taking out the tools and making them understandable to normal people.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about.
And what I'm increasingly doing is I'm finding that I'm coming back to concepts that I was working with back in the 90s, which are when I was doing leadership training. Basically, a lot of the MKP stuff is a sort of ritualized leadership training. You can't lead other people unless you can understand yourself. You can't lead other people unless you can lead yourself. In order to lead yourself, you've got to know about what's going on. So all of these concepts that MKP uses were, for me, totally known, but I come from the leadership training department. You don't call it shadow there, but you do call it something else.
There's one other thing I wanted to take, and it may be helpful for you. I don't know. I'm not going to. I know nothing about South African culture or the culture of the men that you're working with. But when I started going into personal development, which is 80s, one of the things that kept on turning up in my sort of awareness was that my grandparents knew all about this. They were born late 1800s. They were sort of teenagers during the First World War 100 years ago. Okay, and both sides of my sets of grandparents, one thing they knew their Bible, but they also, as part of their sort of normal middle class upbringing and education, they were supposed to understand Greek and Roman and Nordic myths. And Jung is just mythology with an explanation. So my grandparents grew up with all these archetypes around them. Unfortunately, what has happened in modern society is that we've lost this archetypal content. Fewer and fewer people are doing that sort of reading. It's not been lost. Disney, in a one way or another, sort of kept it alive, although in a pretty bastardized form. But as I said, it's being able to recognize, like, now I'm behaving like Loki, one of the Norse gods. It's like Loki. On the Nordic gods, they don't talk about shadow. They just talk about the fact that there's this guy, and on a good day he's helpful, and on a bad day he's a disaster. Loki was the guy who the gods send down as a messenger. When the gods are fucked up and they want to make peace with human beings, they send Loki, who's a good diplomat. So he can talk his way out of anything, right?
Yeah.
But Loki is also the trickster, the coyote. Now, in that mythology, you don't talk about being a shadow or something else. It's just like, it's just two parts of one person. Being a trickster means that you can talk people, you can get the humans to stop hating the gods and carry on sacrificing. Or you can call it being a diplomat. It's just one part of one person. And I think it's really important to help people to understand that they are not a consistent personality who behaves the same way all the time. They are a multitude of personalities responding to the surroundings they find themselves in. And I found some research very recently which actually says that people who can respond in different ways are more likely to survive in a changing world. That's not rocket science, but it does make sense. If you have a fixed personality, if you've gone into, I don't know, being a professional priest in the 1950s, that's a pretty narrow range of behavior. You're expected to be a certain way because of your job and because of your calling and all the rest of it. And it doesn't give you very much room to deal with situations which are outside what you're supposed to deal with, also known as real life. And I think that by spreading this idea that people behave in different ways depending on who they're with, gives people the possibility of, rather than rejecting a shadowy behavior, they can bring to themselves and develop an understanding of a one of the many parts of their personality. And I will stop talking now. I do know this stuff quite well, and I'm not saying it all will work in South Africa, but I think I think I'm battling with the question at the present moment: how do we get men to go to personal development courses? And you're reminding me that actually in the courses that you're running for entrepreneurs, you're actually dealing with the same stuff, but you're not making it. You're not making it the focus. Now, nobody's going to be a good entrepreneur if they haven't got reasonably good people skills, and nobody gets reasonably good people skills unless they are either a psychopath
or they have self-understanding.
Funny enough, I've realized that most entrepreneurs don't make it because of not understanding themselves very well. Okay, in our language, we're talking about shadow, like in my case, it would be feeling for other people that I could make a lot of money today and lose it all because I want to help everyone. So I need to have a balance of it. A lot of guys have their own shadows that also lead them into not being successful business people, successful entrepreneur, successful even in their careers. It could be unemployed, formal employment in other places, but without necessarily understanding themselves fully, including their wounded parts and how their wounded parts make them show them.
God, I get so tired of this wounded part. Your wounded part,
Oh, Mike,
because any part of you that you put a label on, which represents some sort of "I don't want to know about this," is going to become your problem. I mean, like the model that I'm using, and I've been using for 10, 12 years now, is that there is no such thing as a wounded part.
What do you call it in your model?
Well, it's something that it's an event. It's an event that happened in your life.
But you see, I think it's just names. You see, we are all stuck now in linguistics.
Yeah, but I mean, something happened, and I got very well paid for about when was that? 18 years. Last 18 years of my work life, helping people get jobs. And I don't mean short courses for 3 weeks. I'm talking about well-established people, usually in their 40s, who, for absolutely no fault of their own, needed to get a new job. Somebody decided to close down a factory somewhere, not because the factory was doing badly, but because somebody in South Africa sometimes, who own a lot of the insurance industry in this country, they decided to close down an office. I mean, I have 40 people out there, really competent people, really good at selling insurance, and they had to get a new job. Okay. Usually, the thing that made them good at selling insurance was an overcompensation for a childhood experience. Now, I could also say childhood trauma if I wanted to use that language, but I avoid using the language. But we'll say a childhood trauma. Something happened which was difficult for them to handle. They developed developed a survival technology, and 30 years later, that survival technology was the reason, was the reason that the application of that survival technology was the reason that they were amongst the top 10 salesmen in the country.
But Mike, I get that. How do we say it in simpler ways? How do you? Because I know that I understand what is shadow. I understand the wound part to the shadow, right? And I understand everything about it. And I think the struggle is always, for me, my struggle is simplifying it for an ordinary person to understand, without taking like a year or so before they understand it to use it. Because that in itself, in business language, they talk about barriers of trade. These are just barriers of understanding for me. Barriers of people becoming experts in this work. How do we simplify it so that it's a tool that anyone can use? Can grab a book and use it.
Okay, so I mean that's a very big question. But I mean one of my guiding lights is not all this shame and shadows business, but it's part of what the fuck is that called? Can't remember what it's called now. It's called there's a model called appreciative inquiry, which basically says instead of sort of looking at everything you're doing wrong, Bongile, let's look at what's working in your organization or in your life, and let's do more of that. It's so much easier to leverage to leverage the successes, in other words, something which you're innately good at, rather than trying to change something you're bad at.
Indeed.
So I mean, I'm sort of going to try and come back to something I was thinking about when you've been talking. Do you deal with training salesmen or training people in sales techniques?
Yes, I've done that before.
Good.
Yeah.
Fine. Good. Just that's all I needed. So it's so much more meaningful if you have a guy who says, "Oh, I'm not coming up to my budget in this week or this month." That it's so much, in my book, it's so much more meaningful to say, okay, so tell me about all the ones that worked. Tell me about why they worked, why their relationship with that customer is continuing, why they're carrying on giving you orders which make a profit for the company, so you can pay for your mortgage. And then if they have a problem, which is definable, we say, okay, so how do we move the competence from the places where it's working to the places where it isn't working?
Uh-huh.
You got it. It's you know, if you, it's I'm thinking, I'm having to think Swedish and translate to English. Transferable skills.
Wow, I just love that. I just love what just happened now. I was on this same, I was talking with some guy. He's a South African guy. He's white, and then he speaks English, but his mother tongue is Afrikaans. So I was telling him what I have to go through as a black person trying to have a decent conversation with you. That is linguistically correct.
Yeah.
And he just did it now with Swedish, coming back to English. Anyway, continue. Sorry.
No, but basically, it's you know, in English it's called transferable skills, and it's very often so that you know, you can say, well, okay, so what are you good at, and why are you good at it? And it's okay, say, okay, so the reason you're good at it is because you have a skill. So what happens if we take that skill and put it into the area where you're not having much success at the present moment? And this is usually, and we go back to sales, this is usually about how I see the customer. You know, what I'm imagining about the customer. If I have a customer who I always have a great time with, they have an excellent coffee machine, which I've learned how to operate, so I don't get confused about the coffee machine. And there's a really nice chick sitting on the reception, so I feel good as a man when I walk in the place. And they never keep me waiting long. You know, okay, maximum 5 or 10 minutes. I've never been sitting there like for an hour, like some of these shits I have to visit. And you then say, okay, so I've got this customer. It's like, you know, every time I go there, the guy's never there on time. I have to sit there waiting for at least half an hour, or I could be doing something else. The office looks like it's a rat-infested dump. I've actually seen mice running across the carpet, and they have a very, very officious person is sitting in reception. And you can actually say, okay, so we've got a clearly different situation, which is setting up your meeting with your client. So what happens if you refuse to get involved with the rat and you try and talk with the sour bastard sitting in reception? Or you go in with a bunch of flowers and say, hey, I really appreciate the fact that at least your coffee machine works. I mean, I'm just making this up as I go along, but it's really about emotional intelligence. It's about changing the way we respond to the situation we're in, and rather than doing it from a more or less autonomic place where where you're not thinking about it, you actually say, I'm going to walk in here smiling.
I hear you, Mike.
I'm going to walk in here, thinking, fine, okay, so if the guy keeps me waiting for half an hour, I brought along my book so I can sit here reading rather than being pissed off with he's wasting my time. I won't waste my time. I'll have my book. And for me, an awful lot of that stuff, which I was doing back in the 80s and 90s, is what I call, applied personal intelligence or emotional intelligence. And I don't need to tart it up in king, warrior, magician, lover, shadow, all the rest of the stuff. I need
Yeah.
to bring it down. I need to bring it down to a level where my friend Richard's fellow car mechanics can actually use
understand.
it to develop a better relationship with their boss or each other or their wives or their kids.
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
you know, men are the good thing about men is that they are problem oriented.
Yeah.
And you know, if they have a problem, they will usually try and help one another to solve it. They have been taught in most of the world not to be emotionally oriented. So they don't really understand what the emotional process is going on. Women are a bit the other way around. They've been over-taught to understand the emotional processes, and they've been under-taught to be active. If you get a bunch of guys in a room and one of them starts talking about a problem, then what very often happens, and I've seen academic research on this saying, you know, this is pretty much the same order. The other guys in the room will come in and say, yeah, I understand what you're talking about. This is what I did. You'll be getting other people to mirror your situation, as you would call it in psychological language. But actually, men, you know, they say, yeah, I know a guy who sells cheap tires. You know, I got a flat tire on my car. And you can begin there. You can begin at as I said, the fundamental helpfulness of men and advice giving. We want to solve each other's problems, man. I want to solve your problem. I want to solve it. I'm using your problem to solve my problem.
And this was my challenge in my coaching work. I was caught up in, you know, when in MKP they talk about you don't rescue, you don't advise, don't fix.
Yep.
But as a man, there's that innate characteristic of wanting to help and to assist.
Yeah,
advice.
Hang on. I don't know which book you've been reading, Bongili, but I do not see anywhere in the MKP instructions where it says that, you know, anyone in one of our circles or in one of our meetings, it is forbidden to give advice or to help somebody. What it says is that this must be done with the permission of the man who's working.
I think I hear that. And it's probably like that even in the manuals, but
and don't forget that all the stuff
it's probably ventilated as you don't rescue, you know. So it's kind of
rescuing is something different. Rescuing is not dealing with the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's a difference between, you know, you tell me about your shitty life with your, you know, your company, which is going bankrupt and all the rest of it. You're not getting the help. Now, I can choose to do two things. I can choose to say, okay, good. It sounds you're in a bad situation. Tell me what's working. Okay. Or I can sit here and say, oh, I feel so sorry for you, man. It must be so rough. And I really do empathize with you. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'll send you $2,000, which, you know, to get you over the problem, and you just carry on doing what you've been doing before, because I'm sure it might work. Now, you know, the one is supporting you. I'm asking you what's working, and then maybe I can encourage you to do more of it. But at least I'm asking you. And the other one is rescuing you. You know, I'm going to give you a quick fix, and then your problem will be out of the way, which is not a problem, which is not a solution at all. It's just a quick fix, and encouraging you to carry on with the same behavior, which is making your situation bad. But I mean, yeah, there's a big difference between rescuing people, which is actually an emotional process, and supporting other men. I mean, all the I groups that I sit in, we're pretty big on stretches. So that, you know, and we're pretty big on helping each other to see our own idiocy. So we're, you know, we somebody's working, and most of the guys get 15 or 20 minutes to work on an evening. And they usually say, okay, so I'm going to spend, I'll tell you about it for 10 minutes, and then I want some feedback, and I want some help so that I can get a stretch. And that's for me is a functioning I group. But a functioning I group where a bunch of guys sit around listening to each other, complaining about the same stuff they've been complaining about for the last 6 months, I don't want to be there.
I think I've had something like this. Yeah, that was my concerns in one of the I groups. But nevertheless, Mike, I think we must check out.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe connect on WhatsApp also later on with another meeting. I'm checking out with gratitude and joy to be connecting with you and exploring many possibilities. And I think it's very important to have elders, to be surrounded by elders, someone like me who I believe are much younger, and David. And just to because there's depth there, and it's also sharpening my perspective. With that, I'm out. Yes.
I hope. Mike, Independent Wolf, I'm checking out with a feeling of like I'm an awful lot more enthusiastic about living now than I was an hour and a half ago. But it's like, who the fuck are you to put a labor as elder on me? I don't want that labor.
Okay, young man.
But it's happening a lot, so maybe I should be listening to the world surrounding me. I feel at the present moment I'm far more in contact with my competent part of me, which means that a number of jobs which I've been delaying might get done today. And it's like I love your passion. I enjoy being in that. Sometimes as an elder we lose our passion or it takes another form. I love your volcanic passion about this, which I also think is a very important thing. But I'm as I said, it's like I've read so many different books about how to solve these different problems. In the end, it comes down to some pretty basic stuff, and it's very much about communication. How do I make what I'm saying relevant to you?
Uh-huh.
And then we go beyond South Africa and Sweden and theories. We go into real stuff. So I'm checking out a lot happier man than I was an hour and a half ago, and looking forward to our next meeting.
Take care, brother.
And you. Bye.
Bye.
How do I get out of here? How do I get out of it? There.